Everybody. In this video, we're going to talk about multiplying fractions and how you can use visual area and number line models to help your students understand the process of multiplying fractions. So when you're teaching your students to multiply fractions, I would recommend that you start by teaching them how to multiply fractions by whole numbers, just to get them used to the process of doing that. And then you can move on to multiplying fractions by fractions. So for example, when I would first start teaching my students to multiply fractions, I would say if I had the fraction 3/7 and I made two copies of it, how much would I have? Well, if I have one copy of 3/7 and then I make a second copy, so I'll highlight those here, it's relatively easy for your students to see that you have 6/7. So that builds a good baseline for how to multiply fractions by whole numbers. Then you can say, okay, well, what if I had 3/7 and instead of making two copies, what if I made a half a copy? Now, this is kind of a weird concept because they probably haven't made a fraction of a copy before. And you could think that and you could say, okay, well, I'm not even having a whole copy of 3/7. So whatever 3/7 times a half is, it should be less than 3/7. And the question is how much is it? So if I wanted to take my 3/7 and make a half a group of 3/7, I could just take my 3/7 and cut it in half and just keep half of it. So whatever amount this part is, that's the answer to 3/7 times 1/2. But what is that amount? With the way that I have my square cut up right now, these little pieces that I have shaded are a different size than these white pieces or these white long skinny rectangles. So I'm just going to extend this line to split up the whole square into equal sized pieces. And when you count those pieces, it looks like we have 14 of them. And the half group that I'm looking at, the half of 3/7 is 3 of those 14 pieces. And so 3/7 times a half is 3/14. And I would highly recommend that when you're teaching your students, you start off by multiplying by a half because a half is one of the easiest fractions to multiply by. Then, once they understand that concept, then you can move on to doing problems like 3/7 times 2/3, where you split up the 3/7 into groups of three, and you have two of those groups of three. So that's 2/3 of 3/7. And to make it so that the whole is cut up into equal sized pieces, I'll extend these lines, which gives me a total of 21 pieces in the whole, and 6 of them are 2/3 of the 3/7. And notice that my answers are all smaller than the original fraction I was multiplying by. 3/14 is less than 3/7. 6/21, which actually you could reduce this by dividing the top and the bottom by 3, and you get 2/7. That's less than having 3/7. And so that's one way that you can help your students visualize the multiplication process for fractions. And another way that you can help them visualize it is to multiply on the number line. So if I had 9/4 times a half, 9/4, if I count on the number line, I would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9/4. So this is the point, 9/4. And if I want to have a half of a group of 9/4, I just need to take this distance and split it in half. So I'm going to split it in half by like counting in from the side. So maybe I'll count in 1, 2, 3, 4, and then go 1, 2, 3, 4. And then it looks like the halfway mark is going to be right there in the middle of 1 and 1 1/4. And so to figure out what that point is, I need to split all of the other distances on the number line up into an equal sized partition. And these pieces are all going to be eighths because there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pieces between 0 and 1. And so this point right here is the fraction 9/8. So 9/4 equals 1/2. And after your students have been doing this for a while, they'll start to notice a pattern where the answer to the multiplication of the fractions is just the numerators multiplied together and the denominators multiplied together. So you can use area models with shapes to represent the multiplication of fractions, and you can also use number lines to model the multiplication of fractions. And one way that you can also introduce the idea of multiplying fractions to your students is to connect it to the geometric idea of area. So you could ask them and you could say, okay, if I have a rectangle that has side lengths of, let's say, 3 inches and 2 inches, what is the area of that rectangle? And you may need to remind them that area is a two-dimensional measurement that says how many squares of two-dimensional space is inside of the rectangle. And the answer to this is that the area is 6 square inches. Then you could ask and you could say, okay, well, what would be the area of a rectangle that is 3/4 of a unit? And usually when I'm teaching this, I like to use miles because miles are a reasonable unit for something you would have 3/4 of. So I'd say, okay, what if I had like a field or a piece of property that was rectangle shaped, and one of the side lengths was 3/4 of a mile, and one of the side lengths was 1/2 of a mile. What would be the area in square miles of this space? And your students would probably realize that it's got to be less than a square mile because neither one of the side lengths is a full mile long. But the question is um, what fraction of a square mile is it? And so you could help them model this by saying, okay, let's have this green square represent 1 full square mile. So we know that our property doesn't fit within this whole square, like it's going to be smaller than it. But let's figure out what fraction of it will be. So one of our property distances or side lengths is 3/4 of a mile. So let's say that our property line goes along here, right to the 3/4 mark. So that's one side of our property. Then the other side of our property is a 1/2 mile long. So our property goes to here. So this black square right here, or rectangle, I mean, represents our piece of property. And the question is what fraction of a full square mile does our property take up? And we can see that it's definitely less than a half because a half of a square mile would be this amount, either on the top or on the bottom. And we can see that we have less than that. And maybe if I just extend this line here, it will make it so I can split up my square equally. So if I split it up there, I would also want to split it up here and here so that this square mile is cut up into equal sized pieces. And it looks like our property takes up 3 of those pieces. So we would have 3, and the denominator of our fraction would need to be 8 because we have 8 of these little rectangles in the entire square mile. And so a piece of property that is 3/4 of a mile by a 1/2 of a mile would have an area of 3/8 of a square mile. So this is very related to the area models we did on the first slide, but you can actually introduce it to your students as the area of a rectangle instead of just using the area of shapes. So that's another way that you can introduce this idea. And our book introduces even another way that you can introduce the multiplication of fractions, and that's through the idea of presenting meaningful word problems to your students. So let's say, for example, that you have a reusable milk jug that can hold a 1/2 gallon of milk, and my milk jug is 2/3 full. And the question is, how many gallons of milk do I have? So I would recommend giving this to your students and letting them play with it and see what they come up with. And then you can discuss it as a class and see what ideas they have around solving a problem like this. If it were me, the way that I would solve this problem is I would say, okay, well, the first thing that I know is that a reusable milk jug can hold 1/2 of a gallon of milk. So I'm going to draw just like a rectangle to represent a full gallon. So this amount is 1 gallon. And I know that my milk jug, which I'll represent in black, can hold a half of a gallon. So this amount right here is my milk jug. And I'd say, okay, well, my milk jug is 2/3 full. So I'll use red to represent this. And my milk jug is filled up with milk. If I was using a chalkboard, I might use white because it's milk, but I don't want to use white on white with that background. So this part right here represents the 2/3 that's filled up with milk. And the question is how many gallons of milk do I have? Well, I know that I have 2/3 of a milk jug of milk, but a gallon is bigger than my milk jug. So I need to make it so that this whole gallon is split up into equal sized pieces. And since a half of a gallon was split up into thirds to figure out how much milk was in my milk jug, I'm going to split the rest of the gallon, the other half of the gallon, into thirds as well. And so that means that my portion of my milk jug that's filled up with milk is filling 2 out of the 6 pieces that are in the gallon altogether. And so this tells me that the amount of gallons of milk that I have is 2/6. And I could also reduce this by dividing the top and the bottom by 2 to get 1/3 of a gallon of milk. So that's my answer. And your students will probably come up with this answer without knowing that they're even multiplying fractions together. And so after they've solved a problem like this, you can tell them this answer that you got is the answer to 2/3, or actually, I would probably say it's 1/2 times 2/3 because you had a half of a gallon of milk and you had 2/3 of a group of it. So it wasn't even a full half gallon, it was a 2/3 full half gallon jug. And once you show them that this is basically multiplying these fractions together, you'll notice the pattern that 1 times 2 equals 2 and 2 times 3 equals 6. So this is another way that you can introduce the multiplication of fractions to your students. And one of the things that you'll want to discuss with your students is the idea that multiplication makes more. Because when you are working with whole numbers, this is a true statement. Like if you do 3 times 2, you're going to get 6, which is more than either one of those numbers. But when you multiply by fractions, this is not the case. Because if you do 3/4 times 1/2 and you get 3/8, well, 3/8 is smaller than 3/4 or a half. And this is because you're finding a half of a group of 3/4. And one thing that you can do to kind of highlight this is you can multiply the same fraction by 3 different numbers. You can multiply it by a fraction that's less than 1. You can multiply it by 1 itself, and then you can multiply it by a fraction that is greater than 1. And when you look at this, notice that when you multiply by 1, you get the same fraction, you get 3/4. And that makes sense because of the identity property of multiplication. And if you make less than 1 copies of the fraction, you get something smaller. And if you multiply by something greater than 1, then you end up with a fraction that's bigger than 3/4. And so having this discussion with your students is important. And you can ask them, like, why is our answer smaller than either one of the fractions? Because usually students will create this mental construct in their head that multiplication makes something bigger, which is true when it comes to whole numbers. And so it's important to help them analyze the fact that it's not true when you're talking about fractions. So if you have any questions, let me know. And I hope that you guys have a great day.